Welcome to Junction. It is a pleasure to hold again after almost 6 months of absence from holding events in English. We had some events in Thai during this period, but the one in English, this is the very first one after February. So it is, I am very happy that we can start again, although unfortunately we cannot have the crowds like we used in the past, thanks to the containment measure for COVID-19, even if there is no COVID in Thailand. I mean, but still we have to keep to the rules. It is a blended event, so we will broadcast live while also have some public and the speaker are here. So it's a little bit more lively than the usual Zoom event, so to say. My name is Sciortino and I am the founder and director of Junction. And Junction is a public venue. As for those who have not been here yet, it's a small public venue, reading room. You can come and read about Southeast Asia. And we have events like this. And next week we will have a movie screening, an Indonesian movie screening, and also photo exhibition. The next one will be about COVID and migration and will be downstairs. So we use other space also when needed. Now today we are very happy to collaborate with Rapid Asia, represented here by Daniel, and ILO, represented here by Andreas. And the other one, the other lady, Ratchada, she is an old friend and she teaches at Chulalongkorn University, but also she is with the Commission on Women and Children, representative for Thailand. So the first two will present the report, the finding of the study, and also how the report was conducted, while Ratchada will give a comment on those reports. So I believe will be a very interesting before we open up for the discussion. So please, Daniel, you are the first.
Thank you, Nia. A big welcome to all of you, both those of you here in person and those of you watching through online streaming. Rapid Asia is one of the founding partners of Junction, and we are very happy to see the great job that Leah has done with this place and make it into something really special. Today we will present and discuss about attitudes towards migrant workers. The report came out last year, but due to the pandemic, we had to put this presentation on hold. This study was a collaborative effort between Rapid Asia, ILO, and UN Women. And it was a report that we also did back in 2010. So this will give us the ability now to look at the results and compare and see how attitudes to migrant workers have changed over time. I'm joined here by Andreas Schmidt from ILO and also Ratchada Jayagupta from Chulalongkorn University. So it looks like I'm in good company here. Yeah, thank you for joining this. For my part, there are 3 things I would like to share. First, a brief introduction of Rapid Asia. Second, I will take you through how we measure attitudes to migrant workers. And finally, and probably more interestingly, I will share some of the results, in particular how attitudes to migrant workers have changed over time. So, who is Rapid Asia? For those that don't know, we are a social development and research consulting firm based here in Bangkok. I founded Rapid Asia back in 2010, so this year we're also celebrating our 10-year anniversary, which is nice. We work with a broad mix of clients, including donors, UN agencies, international foundations, and NGOs. We are probably best known for the work that we have done in migration, some of our gender studies, food security, agriculture, and also in climate change. Here just briefly, you can see our footprint since 2010. So to date we have carried out various projects in over 30 countries around the globe. Now, regardless of who we work with, all of our clients have one thing in common. and that is they want to change something. This could be changing or introducing new policies, or it could be making changes in beneficiary behavior. Either way, to realize that change, they need evidence. And that is, in a nutshell, what Rapid Asia does. We go out there and we find the evidence needed to make that change happen for our clients. So, if you want to change attitudes to migrant workers, how would you go about measuring that? Let's look first at the scope of the study we did last year. We wanted to examine public attitudes to migrant workers in 4 countries: in Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and in Thailand. Japan was included because it's become increasingly open to labor migration. The other 3 countries were also surveyed back in 2010, so provided for an opportunity to compare results and see how attitudes have changed over time. There was also some added focus on women-specific issues this last survey, including violence against women. I believe Andreas will talk a little bit more about some of those findings. In total, we surveyed over 4,000 people from the general public, and we used what's called an online access panel. The panel was used because you can do a national survey at a more cost-effective price. However, panels tend to be skewed to younger and sort of urban populations, so we had to use quotas and also weight the data to make it representative of the national population. So that was done based on age, sex, and region. To add a bit more context to the findings, we also carried out a number of key informant interviews with various stakeholders. So, how did we measure attitudes to migrant workers? And more importantly, how did we measure change in attitudes? Some of you maybe work in education. So when you do studies in education, you always have some data available, like completion rates, participation rates, and so on. If you do a study on safety helmets, you can actually go out and observe and see whether people are wearing helmets or not. Attitude to migrant workers does not have the benefit of these. It's intangible. You don't really have ready data available, and it's also what we call a multifaceted issue. There is no one particular behavior that people need to adopt. Instead, a number of things needs to be considered, like people need to be more open-minded or more inclusive, and so on. So we needed some kind of proxy model for measuring this change, and the CAP-score model, published in 2019, had a very good fit for what we needed to do. I want to briefly explain how the model works, and then we can look at the survey findings with a better appreciation of the results and what they mean. The model basically has 2 assumptions that underlies it. First, it's based on what's known as stage theory, which states that change happens in incremental stages. It's not black and white. We can think of change as a journey, moving from, say, knowledge formation up to sort of people having full compliance. This applies to most behavior. Take jaywalking, for example, crossing a street unlawfully. Few people would be jaywalking every time they cross a street. And likewise, there are few people that can say they have never jaywalked in their entire life. Most people are somewhere in the middle. So in other words, we are more interested in the extent to which people are compliant with behavior, not about those that are 100% compliant. And that is the nuances that this model helps to pick up. The second assumption is that change starts in the mind. When do you decide, for example, to change your brand of mobile phone? Do you decide when you go out to buy a new mobile phone, or is it maybe some time before that? The truth is, it can happen at any time. But as consumers, you will go through these stages. It could take a few minutes, or it could take a few years. It depends on the situation. But the decision for the change has to start in your mind. So understanding what's going on in the heads of people is far often more important than just observing their behavior. Think of silent racism, for example. This is not something that we can easily see, but it's instrumental in producing institutional racism. So, to estimate where people are on this journey, we ask them a series of questions around their knowledge, their attitudes, and their practice or behavior in relation to migrant workers. And depending on how they answer those questions, we can approximate where they are on this journey. And across a representative sample, that estimation becomes quite accurate. The CAP index is one of the key indicators that we use to show evidence of change. It shows the average position on the journey for a given population at a given point in time. So if we measure in two different time periods, we can see if things have changed. And because the CAP index is based on several questions, not just one question, we can feel quite confident that the evidence of change represents real change. Okay, I hope that explanation was useful, and thank you for bearing with me. Now let's look at some of the results. One of the key findings of this study was the relationship between attitudes, or you could say level of support of migrant workers, and the extent to which people have encounters with migrant workers. People who employed migrants or who had friends that were migrants were found to be much more supportive of them compared to those that had never encountered any migrant workers. You can see the sloping line there in the charts representing the CAP index. This result was consistent across all the countries, including Japan, both in 2010 and 2019. So, how did result change from 2010 to 2019? First, if you look at the bars there, you should note that the CAP index is very low. It ranged from 12 up to 36. That's a very low CAP index. This shows that people have very limited knowledge about migrant workers and how they contribute to the economy and so forth. In other words, support for migrant workers is generally very low across all three countries. Comparing the results between 2010 and 2019, you can see that there has been a marginal drop in all three countries. Malaysia had the lowest drop with 3 points on the CAP index, but they also had the lowest level of support for migrants to start with. Singapore and Thailand had a drop of 7 points each. But we also had some unusual results. When looking at the change in interaction with migrants, workers, we found that interactions had actually increased in Malaysia and Thailand. In Singapore it had remained more or less the same. But if that was the case, why didn't support for migrant workers go up? As we have seen, when there's more interaction, people are more supportive, but the index actually went down. So to answer that, we had to look a little bit deeper into the data. And what we found was that there has been an increase in polarization. And here's a graphical representation of what it can look like. So So the blue line represents results from 2010, and the red line 2019. Over to the right, you have the people who have regular interactions with migrant workers. In this group, there was no change between the two time periods. Those with occasional interactions in the middle, we could see there was a marginal decline in support. However, those with no interaction had a very significant drop in all three countries. The CAP index dropped 20 points in Singapore, 25 and 27 points in Thailand and Malaysia. So more interaction still means stronger support for migrant workers. However, those that didn't have any interaction have now become far more negative towards them. Hence the increase in polarization. To put this into a bit more context, I want to share a story. It's election today in the US, so I guess it's appropriate. An interesting story. You may recall the immigration ban early on in the Trump administration. There were many demonstrations against the ban, but there was a bit of an odd protest that I caught on TV. It was also picked up by a reporter. A group of Trump supporters were protesting in support of a Muslim man in their community who was at risk of being deported. The reporter asked if they had voted for Trump, and they said, yes, we did. Okay. So then she went on to ask, are you aware that it was Trump who introduced the immigration ban? Yes, they said. So why are you protesting? She asked. And they said, because we know him. I'm sure all of you can see the hypocrisy in this. But I'm also pretty sure that those protesters didn't actually see it that way. They did support the ban on one hand, but they didn't feel that it applied to this particular Muslim man because he was known to them. So in closing, what can we learn from these findings? In my own view, I think there are two things we can take out from this. First, we should not generalize when we talk about migrant workers. Instead, we should be specific about who we talk about. Is it a man or woman? Is it a domestic worker or a construction worker? Give them a face, something that people can relate to. Think about the protesters in Texas. To them, that Muslim man was not some illegal alien. They knew him, so he was an exception. So we need to find ways to make migrant workers be seen as exceptions. Secondly, when influencing policy change, the focus should be on integration rather than on segregation. Why are people in cosmopolitan cities generally around the world more supportive of migrant workers compared to those living in rural areas, for example? I think it's because they see them every day. They see the domestic worker, they see the construction workers, they see the manufacturing workers, and so on. They see what they contribute, and they can gain an appreciation for what they do. Okay, that concludes my presentation. I think now we give over to Andreas. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Daniel. So now we change the places, ready to go. I'm Andreas Schmidt. I work for the ILO here in Bangkok in the regional office. And I work in a technical cooperation program called Triangle in ASEAN. And the aim of this program is to support the migrant workers in ASEAN and their contribution to the development of the countries here. And this program is supported by the Australian Government, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade DFAT, and Global Affairs Canada. We also authored this study together with another ILO program called Safe and Fair, and this is part of the European Union UN Spotlight Initiative, and implemented in collaboration with UNODC and funded by the EU. So far to our programs and to our donors. What I'm going to talk about is very briefly about a few trends of labor migration in ASEAN, then some select findings, as Daniel said, from the study. I go into a bit more detail of a couple of things which I found interesting and which probably can facilitate the discussion or give some hints for the implementers where to start, and then a few recommendations more from ILO side and our responses so far. Okay, let's start. I went through the news. I mean, I do it regularly, but I looked at what I have from the past few months, and not surprisingly, COVID-19 had huge impact in how migrants and migrant workers are portrayed and how they are actually shown in the public. So this particular one stuck with me. No new normal for Asia's virally unwanted migrants. Stuck because what is virally unwanted, so I couldn't get this out of my mind. That was from actually a Reuters article from September. Oh, sorry, need to go forward. Next one, Red Cross warns coronavirus is driving discrimination in Asia. Okay, now probably also not a surprise. The last one, also an interesting one, is from Myanmar, where there were reports back in May that actually not just the migrant workers, mostly from Thailand, who returned, but also the doctors who supported them faced discrimination in their communities. And that being said, it's also, I think, elaborated in this article, even after the migrant workers underwent 2 weeks mandatory quarantine plus another 7 days at home, so after 21 days, and then they went out, searched for support, and still faced discrimination. What I want to highlight here, that this topic is still very relevant, especially in these times. And whereas this study looked at the countries of destination for migrant workers, now we also need to look at the migrant workers returned back to their country of origin. And actually also many of them would like to come back. Like we did another survey that came out in June, ILO, we did it, and many of the surveyed migrant workers in Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Myanmar said, well, no, as far as I get a chance, I will go back and work in Thailand or in other countries of destination. So now to the statistics. This is from 2019 and 2018. So if you ask why not more recent, so maybe you work in the in research, and if you look at that, we normally use a couple of surveys, and it always takes a long time until this data is in and cleaned and made available. So ILO, we support the countries in the region maintaining a so-called ILMS, International Labor Migration Statistics database, and that's the data from there, and it's getting updated soon. But anyway, what to highlight is this in red, that actually in Malaysia, Singapore and Thailand, migrant workers make quite a significant amount of the workforce. In Malaysia, around 20%, whereas these are official figures, and unofficial estimates, the World Bank did a study on that, they go a lot higher, but it's always a bit tricky to estimate. So that's the official figures. In Singapore, not a surprise, 38%, and in Thailand around 8%. Of course, now it would be also interesting to see how that went down after COVID, but yeah, we need to wait and see. Oh, I'm always jumping. The next one is a map about so-called dependency ratio. I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's actually a measurement. Okay, some people not, that's good. That's actually a measurement of how many migrant workers or general workers it needs to replace the local workforce. So simply said, everything you see there in gray are these countries with an aging population, with shrinking workforce, and which need migrant workers in the medium term. This one talks about 2030. And the blue ones, they have a surplus in labor and would be able, in theory, to support these gray countries. And there are not many changes looking at nowadays. I think the net sending countries are mostly the same as nowadays, with one notable exception. Vietnam will become gray. They're now sending out more migrant workers than they receive, but this will change. So what to highlight here is actually that in these receiving countries, which are receiving countries today, there is still a need in the future. So now we go to some select findings. There are a couple of graphs, but I try to highlight what's interesting about them. First of all, Daniel said that already. Starting very generally, what effect do migrant workers have on the national economy? We asked that across these 4 countries. Rapid Asia did it for us through the panels. And what's interesting here is that across the 4 countries, there is a lot of polarization. Like you can see either people responded that they have an overall negative effect or an overall positive effect, but not sure is really a small group or no impact at all also. So people tend to have some strong opinions, whether positive or negative. We also see that actually the overall negative effect in Malaysia is quite high, and unfortunately we see that I think across the whole survey. Malaysia is always a bit on the top of this negative perception. Going into one which is also which polarizes people is migrants and crime. There were also a couple of studies before this which looked into how migrants or migrant workers are perceived in terms of crime rate. Will it go up, will it go down, or does it have no effect? And also in this survey it came out, actually this is referring this slide to 2 questions. First, there was a statement, migrants commit a lot of crime, and you see that there is I think it's only the majority in Malaysia and Thailand, but still in Singapore and Japan there is the perception shared among quite a large amount of these panelists. And the second question was how many people would think that crime rates are actually increasing due to migration, and that looks even worse. That's not in the graph, but over half of the respondents in Singapore and Japan, 75% in Thailand, and 83% in Malaysia said yes, they are increasing according to their observation. And interesting here is that it's not really based on any evidence. There are a couple of studies, and we can just look at one which looked at 100,000 migrant workers in Malaysia, which came in, and actually the crime rate after that decreased by 9.9%. So this generalization, as shown from the survey, is by no means valid, or it cannot be backed up. Then about inclusion and threats, and also here the attitudes in the 2019 survey were actually quite negative across all countries except Japan. We have a majority saying that the migrant workers threaten the country's culture and the heritage, and also interesting, they have a poor work ethics, and the respondents couldn't trust them. There is a majority in Thailand actually. Now on the side, on the bottom range, there on the bottom you can see that actually the respondents were more open to migrant worker women. We asked them whether they can marry, or whether they should be able to marry local citizens if they want to, and whether they would be allowed to have children when or during their migration process. And there the picture was a lot more positive, and that's across the board except maybe Singapore, but I think it's not really much different. Now coming to more ILO topics which we are interested in. Public attitudes on equal treatment when working with the national workers. Migrant workers should not be able to join a union. There is a large majority in Malaysia, but also other countries quite interestingly say they should not be allowed to join unions. And then about conditions and payment benefits, there are also majorities in all countries except Japan that saying that they should not allow to receive the same pay and benefits as the local workers. Now again, looking at women specifically, whether women should receive the same payment compared with a national woman, migrant worker woman, national woman. And here again, it looks more positive. That's again found quite interesting because that's across the board. And that goes on here in offering maternity leave and support to pregnant migrant workers. There is also more support if you compare it to other statements. And I flag this because I think that's probably a good entry point for the practitioners when we start with, as Daniel said, give migrants a face or start a campaign, then I think that would be a good starting point to build on this relatively positive feelings. Now, coming to support for migrant workers who experience violence, and there is, luckily, personally, I think there is a large majority who support that they should get support. So, and this is also one of the strongest support which came out from this survey. So that would be also a very good starting point because that's usually a very underreported subject because victims don't speak out or nobody want to talk about it. But given that there is a lot of public support for that, yeah, it's a good starting point. Now coming to domestic migrant workers, that's I found a bit interesting personally. We asked to support for improved labor conditions for domestic migrant workers, and we asked the employers who have domestic migrant workers themselves and those who do not. And then interestingly, those who do employ migrant workers, they actually to a lesser degree say we need to improve this working condition. So on the other hand, the general public says yes, I would support to improve their working conditions. So again, that may be a good starting point for a campaign. And then lastly, I think that I can cut it short because Daniel spoke about it, about the interaction with migrant workers. Yeah, that was, I think, also the most important finding for us, for the person and the organization who want to put that into practice, that actually interaction does increase the positive attitudes toward migrant workers. So now a few recommendations, which are also, some of them are in the report. Just try to shorten it. Promote the inclusion of migrant workers, social interaction, and the community engagement with the migrant workers. And very important for us is ILO and our partners, project partners, conduct awareness raising activities with the public. Leverage on the support, what I said, for domestic workers and women migrant workers. And also address harmful stereotypes. This, what I said, silence on violence and harassment, and these declining attitudes towards domestic migrant workers. And lastly, provide essential services to women migrant workers who face violence for the reasons I mentioned. So for ILO, we did a lot of work around the point 2, a lot of awareness raising, and try to leverage on the public support. We have done a couple of videos, engaged university students in Thailand and in Malaysia into the discussion, and tried to ask them to question their own beliefs about migrant workers. We also regularly have events. Maybe some of you joined at the International Migrants Day here at Chulalongkorn University, and also in all our countries in the region. There's usually a large one-day event. The Domestic Workers Day on June, International Women's Day. It's still very big in some countries here in the region, where we have events, and then we also promote respect for language. Another point, like when domestic workers are referred to as servants or as maids, there must be a more respectful term, like domestic worker, for example, which actually don't reduce them to this role and actually emphasize that they do work. Okay, so let me close now.
Can you hear me? Okay. Sawadika, both audiences here and also on the Facebook online streaming. First off, I would like to congratulations both to Rapid Asia and ILO for this report, and especially the report on the attitudes. It's very one of the challenge research that we were conducted as well. Actually, I would like to have my reflection in twofold. One will be regard on, since I have only 10 minutes, one will be on the recommendations, my reflection on the recommendation of this report, and second will be on the collaboration and support from network and society, especially from the ASEAN region. First off, according to the recommendation, for the first one, promote inclusion, social interaction, and community engagement with migrant workers in destination countries, including through changes to policy and practices. I would like to raise about the issue of the city planning, that one of the recommendations that you mentioned there, that by mention about city planning, but it according to the Thailand context as well, that the employer's responsibility should also be an important factor as well to providing the accommodation and safe space for the migrant worker themselves. And also in regard to the when you mention about ensure that labor migration governance mechanisms are accessible, affordable, and not time consuming, I would like to add that it should not be a complex, like guidance. And should be the language, especially the language or instruction, must be migrant friendly as well. Because normally we found out sometimes it's very technical for us as well when we're reading those instructions, and that we would like to emphasize their rights, and also with the concerned factors, agencies, that also to respect the migrants' rights as well, so that it should be not to be complex and should be a language that friendly to the concerned persons, agencies. For the second for conduct awareness raising activities with the general public, one of your recommendation, one of your findings regards on the silence on violence from the women migrant groups, right? And that also in accordance with our findings as well on the research that we've done on our ASEAN campaign on ending gender-based workplace exploitation. What we found out that the voices of the migrant women heard because they would like to secure their jobs. So that is one of the reasons that probably we need to find the strategic way or the state of the art, how we could provide a safe space or comfortable space for them to voice out. And then once they voice out, what are the complaint mechanisms or the safe space where they can receive the assistance or counseling services. And in this case, you also mentioned about the public awareness and the campaign for the public, right? And also for for the employers as well, right? And that link with the recommendation 3 in regard to the opportunities available giving in a high degree of public support for women migrant workers, including opportunities to address violence against women. So this is the linkage between the findings and recommendation from the point 2 and also with the point 3 that the campaign should be aligned to each other, like for the campaign for the public itself and also the campaign that directly reach the migrant workers themselves as well. So, for example, in terms of the effective communication, migrant workers may not use the same channels of their communications as the public. For example, our survey also found out that for developing the ASEAN campaign, we found out that most of the women migrant workers who working in Thailand, they normally prefer to use Facebook and TikTok as their social media channel. So meaning that if the information that we would provide to them, that if we provide it into live channel, they might not receive it at all, right? So that in terms of effective communication, that we need to also consider that which the social media channel that really benefiting them. And another point that I would like to raise is that in terms of the challenges on the measuring the attitude, as we are aware that attitude may change rapidly over time and rapidly. For example, in the stage of the COVID pandemic, right? And now we're on the new normal stage after the COVID. And that we need to bring into consideration that in terms of promoting the rights of migrant workers and also the advantages of having migrant workers working in our countries to the public. And then as in terms of the human rights approach that we should not leave anyone behind, and also we need to treat all of them equal. And another point that I would like to reflect is on the collaboration and support from network and society. I think that's also mentioned in several of your recommendations as well, but I would like to bring the evidence-based approach that you mentioned. That in the ASEAN region, we also have the work plan that we need to accomplish by the current work plan finishing this year 2020. And one of the concrete examples in terms of focusing on the women migrant workers, and for the first phase, we're focusing Thailand as destination country. So meaning that the majority of the women migrant workers are from Myanmar, Laos, PDR, and Cambodia. We started this project since 2018, starting with the workshop where we invited all concerned agencies, including ASEAN sectoral bodies, international organizations, including ILO. I think Rapid Asia were you there at that time? We have the CSOs at ASEAN level as well, ASW. We have Forum Asia, we have Foundation for Women. We have colleagues from UN agency, as I mentioned, ILO, IOM, IOMX, and other as well. And we worked together at first. Our target was to build the ownership together. We would like to focus on at first, the target population has not concluded yet to be women migrant workers, but we discussed and brainstorming who are the target population. I mean, in terms of the mutual benefit and interest among 10 ASEAN member states. And we conclude that the women migrant workers will be the first priority that we would like to focus, and also including the employer as well. So at that time, it came out that we focus on women migrant workers and the employers. And next step, that how we could reach them. And we found out, we did a further research, and we found out that it's very hard for them to voice out. And how we would like to find the effective communication. In this case, when I mention effective communication, meaning that two-way communication, it's not only the top-down or bottom-up, but need to be effective in terms of both employers, concerned agencies, and migrant workers themselves. And at this stage, it's not only the violence against women or girls that we already mentioned, but we also brought up the issue that is on the top priority areas of the ASEAN, that was the human trafficking as well. So this is also the comment that I would like to also add in the finding, in the research methodology here as well. When you refer to the women issue, so not only the violence, but probably it would be better to include the issue of human trafficking as well. The reason behind that is that it's also linked to SDG 5 when we're talking about gender equality. And under that sub-goal, it's mentioned about violence and also trafficking in persons as well. So that it would be a good package that include all the inclusive issues that related to the women migrant workers. With that campaign, we received a support and also contributions and also assistance, both technical and financial, from the DFAT Australia, the Asia Foundation, IOM, IOMX, UN Women, and also from the CSO partner that I already mentioned, and also with the academia as well. And with that, since 2018, you can see the progress of the development. So that I would like to show share the experience that when we're talking about the public awareness, is related to the norms and the outcome, right? So cannot happen within a day or a month. It needs to have a very well planned and then the effective implementation as well. So this is the nexus that we brought into this campaign, which later on I can share you the link later, that bring to the thematic area of elimination of violence against women and children, and with the trafficking in women and children, and also the gender perspective in regard to the migrant workers, that under our plan, ACWC plan. And not only in our plan, but that's also in cross collaboration with other ASEAN sectoral body, which is ACW, ASEAN Committee on Women, SOMTC Senior Official Meeting on Trans-Organized Crime, and also with ACMW, the ASEAN Committee on Migrant Workers as well. So this is that it takes time, it needs a lot of effort, and also it needs the collaboration and harmonious among the public, and also with especially with the concerned agencies, both at the community level, national level, and regional level, national level as well.
Thank you, Ratchada, and we are going to open the floor first here, and then we have two questions from our online visitors. So anyone here who would like clarification, question, comments, please introduce yourself and then ask.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Hans. I'm studying at Chula, Masters in Masters in International Development Studies. I'm from the Philippines. And of course, the Philippines is one of the top source of migrant workers. So I'm just actually interested to know, because in terms of discussing migrant workers, we always imagine that these are domestic workers. And then I kept on looking at the study. There's missing factor, and the respondents should know, what does a migrant worker really mean? Because in the study it says like those people who are going to a country to work. But maybe on how people perceive migrant worker is equal to domestic worker might have affected how they perceive migrant workers in general. Do you think that we need to be more concise on how we describe migrant workers? And also, sorry, that's the first one. The second one would be, do you think that we need to be more careful in terms of identifying the respondents in regards to their educational background? Because I think Japan, as what I saw earlier, they're more intolerant. They're not that accepting to migrant workers. Maybe because they don't speak English, so they're afraid. They're kind of like not so into talking in a foreign language, because again, Japanese people, they're kind of they tend to look at their culture and language as very much above everyone. So it might have affected us how they answered as well the survey. And the third one, how do you think this would create an impact in terms of policy making? Because it's very important that these surveys could actually relate to how governments could react, especially in terms of discrimination and racism. And even if we're saying that Southeast Asia is a very unified region, we are still racist, and we need to accept that. I mean, Filipinos are racist, and I don't know in this part of the region if they consider this as a racist. But this one is very kind of alarming, because I thought we should not be dealing or talking about this anymore because we're already 2020. So sorry, I have those 3 questions. Thank you.
Well, it seems racists make politicians popular, so this is a problem with that. But anyway, forget about the US election, of course. So we have 2 more questions for here. Not, so I will also ask the 2 questions, and then the 3 panelists can answer. It's related to what has been said in a sense. The question is whether the perception change according to the nationality of the migrants and the gender of the migrant, as well as the occupation of the migrants. Now, there were mentioned about the domestic worker and the sex worker, but what about rural workers? So not only the one working in the city, but the one working in the countryside. Is there a different perception of them? So basically, can you provide more information about the details of if there are differences according to the gender, the status of the migrants themselves? While he asked more about education, etc., of those having the perceptions. So let's start this time from Ratchada, and then we go the other way around.
Okay. Actually, my response I will let those who done the survey report respond to you in regard to the essence from this report. But in terms of our work, especially for this the campaign, actually the perception change are since most of the parties they're working with, they were working closely with migrant workers, so we didn't see differences, right? So we treat everyone equally, and especially like again for this campaign, we do respect the rights of migrants in terms of implementing the migrant worker centric approach. So the design, the color that you've seen in here, and also with the EDM music that we tested many times with the migrant workers. So these the thing that they really like, not we like, but they really like. So meaning that they can access to information and the design and the channel that really suitable for them, and then they're accessible for them and friendly for them. So
short counter question. You said perception of Filipinos abroad is they are domestic workers, so that's
no, not really. I mean, this year the questions, it was asked like, I mean, it was defined that migrant workers are those people who go abroad for.
okay.
But and then the next questions were like leaning towards domestic workers. So there might have like kind of how to say this? Like it might have reinforced that when you talk about migrant workers, you're talking about domestic workers.
Okay.
But that's wrong, right?
Yeah, it shouldn't be like that, and I think in the survey it also it wasn't formulated like that, and it didn't came out like that. We just, as ILO, we have interest in domestic workers. That's also why I presented that, but it doesn't mean migrant workers equal domestic worker. It shouldn't also give this look to people, right? I mean that would be wrong. And Okay, or did I answer you? Okay. Okay. Yeah, about nationality and rural city, maybe Daniel can talk about. I think that wasn't really part of the survey. Gender, of course, was, and I think that got worked out from the results also in the report, that there seems to be more favorable comments towards women migrant workers. Yeah, of course. No, I was glad you spoke it out, that you said we are racist, and we acknowledge that, or some people acknowledge that. No, definitely, a lot more work needs to be done in that. And as ILO, actually, I didn't bother to mention a couple of conventions which some countries signed and some not. Like there are a couple of conventions which are about to be ratified for domestic workers and anti-harassment and violence, and unfortunately I think we are not there yet, but that's ILO's work to push the governments in the region to ratify those at the policy level.
Those countries are like CEDAW, I think, and also the Covenant on Migrant Workers in Thailand. I think these were already happening.
Yeah, the one not is on domestic workers, not yet.
But CEDAW, well, CEDAW is already kind of a strong foundation, and also the migrant workers in Japan is very strong.
Right.
So I think that's a good kind of basis in order for them to push for more policies protecting the migrant workers.
Yeah, it's a good basis, and then that actually opens the floor for us to, as ILO, to step in and say, you ratified that.
Yeah.
Please also ensure.
And nice.
Hello? Okay. To your first question, we didn't focus on domestic workers per se, and I don't think that's how people perceive it. I mean, it may be that when you say migrant worker, some people think of a domestic worker, other people may think of something else. I do think, in hindsight, you could say, it would have been interesting to get people's perceptions about workers from different countries, for example. We know from studies we've done in other parts of the world, like in the Middle East, clearly there is different preferences, workers who come from, say, Bangladesh versus India versus, say, Philippines, or, from Ethiopia or something like that. There are clear differentiation and sort of a hierarchy. So yes, I think for future studies it would be interesting to look at that dimension. That was difficult for this one because of how we wanted to set up the methodology, and we also wanted to compare results to the previous study. So that brought in certain sort of limitations on what we could do. But it's a very good suggestion. To your other question, are people in Japan more educated, so they would have a different view, or they don't speak English? I mean, this was using an online panel, so the survey was in native language. People filled it out in their own time, in the comfort of their own home. So I don't think education or country had any kind of bias. Japan scored very low overall for support of migrant workers, significantly lower than even Malaysia. And so that's a reflection of the culture. Japan has only recently opened up for migrant workers, so it's fairly new. So maybe for many people it's a bit of a shock. They live on an island, it's isolated. Not a lot of foreigners, come and go compared to, say, countries like Singapore, Malaysia, or Thailand. So the exposure to migrant workers, I mean, we're talking to low-skilled migrant workers, you don't really have that maybe to the same extent. So that probably has more impact, I think, rather than people's education and their and other things. To Leah's question, yes, no, I think definitely people have different views on workers from different industries and so on. But I think what we learned from this study is that when we talked about migrant workers more generally, people tended to have fairly sort of negative attitudes, and they were kind of dominant. When we then started to talk about female domestic workers and female workers, and we start talking about specific issues like equality in wage and things like that, then all of a sudden people were a lot more supportive about those sort of ideas. And hence my comment in the presentation is that when you sort of generalize something, people tend to sort of give a very generalized response also. But if you focus on specific issues and they can sort of relate to it and see how it makes sense, then I think people become a bit more sensitive to what is at play. But okay, I think there needs to be more work on that. I don't think this survey proves everything, but that's it.
Like you suggested earlier, like having a face, humanize migrant workers.
No, I think that's really important, because when you generalize, I mean, people talk about refugees, migrants, family reunification. They think of them as all being the same, and they're very different.
Okay, I open again for a last round, and the one that talk here, they need to talk in the microphone, otherwise the people online are not able to listen. Unfortunately now we are have to make it work with this blended system. So the last three questions here, anyone? Okay, one. No others? Okay, please.
Hi, my name is Vanessa, and I'm also with the MAIDS program. And this is directly for you, Ajahn. It's about like providing safe space and accessibility to aids and stuff like that for the women migrants and stuff like that. What do you think would be the incentives for the employee to provide those kind of assistance for the workers? Just in general, I guess, with the specific to the application for them.
I see if there is no more. Okay, then Ratchada.
Okay, in response to your question, in terms of the safe space, we also design alternatives for them as well. Normally, like of course, the employee can report things that happen with them within the company, right? But if he or she doesn't feel secure, so they have options for alternatives. For example, for this case, that we also work closely with the hotline number, the national hotline number 1300. So that's the official channel. Second is the NGO channel. So the NGOs in the particular provinces can receive the call or the incident report from the person, the migrants. And also nowadays we also in the progress of the developing the application. Actually the applications already exist, but also one of the window, the platform that they will design especially for this issue, the violence and human trafficking issue. The thing is that according to our data, that normally nowadays people tend to use social media channel rather than calling people. And also one of the challenges is that also in terms of translation services, because sometimes the translator does not be at the site, like for example 1300, right? for this application, they will use the application, so at the preliminary translate to, to Thai or to English first from the language. So that meaning that when it's come to the hot issue or hotline, we will ensure that that person will be immediately receiving assistance or counseling service.
Okay, there are no more questions. I give a last opportunity to all the speakers to give their final comment, or maybe you want to add something to what has been said, and then we can go outside and enjoy the coffee and tea. Yes, so please also reflect on how to impact on the policy. How are you going based on this study to ensure that it makes a difference in terms of policy? Okay, Daniel?
Well, I think we policymakers, you have to come with really hard evidence. I'm not so sure that general findings around that people are negative to migrant workers per se would necessarily persuade them. You would have to show that also in some sort of economic context. So you would have to, I think, in connection with a study like this, you would also have to provide other types of data to show how dependent the country is on migrant workers and what they contribute to the economy. And then you can contrast those results with, people don't see this as being true. They think they are only here, as thieves and thugs and, bringing COVID and things like that. And I think if you do that together, you can then build a case to persuade them. But you need a lot more data.
Okay, just quickly, I agree with Daniel. I think most have a very, very negative view, but I think most policymakers wouldn't probably care if we present this study, but it needs to come with some pressure. Like I'm thinking, I don't want to take the stance, but for example, this free trade agreement between EU and Cambodia on some certain goods, it doesn't exactly fit because it's about the labor conditions, which now is suspended. So I think that's one thing where it starts to hurt. But unfortunately, what we see, it may generate pressure for Cambodians to migrate because then there will be less opportunities in Cambodia. So it's probably not a very good example, but I think it needs to come with some pressure and some, no carrots, but more sticks. And in general, I think this policy making process is a very long process, and what we can do as ILO, what I said, we start going out and lobbying and give migrant workers exposure and run campaigns. I think it's a slow but steady process.
Yeah, if I can just add something that came to mind when we talk about it. I think it's an interesting case. That was also a study we did for ILO in Ethiopia. They had a migration ban, so this is a little bit differently. This was preventing workers from Ethiopia to going to the Middle East, for example. So they were not allowed to do that. So they put a ban because there was so much abuse and forced labor taking place. So the solution was, don't migrate, just stay in Ethiopia. So of course what happened then was people started to go through irregular channels. And then, the abuse just escalated, both in transit and at destination. And so when we did that study, we were able to show a very clear relationship between forced labor abuse and, the channels that people were going through. And actually, after that study, I think there were other studies being done as well, the ban was lifted. So they could see that this doesn't make sense. This just puts people at greater risk, and because they're Ethiopians, of course the government had an interest in protecting their own people. So that, I think, is a sort of an example of how you got to bring out sort of hard evidence and connect the dots to really bring a case that can persuade policymakers.
So we still believe in facts and evidence, in spite of the word. In spite of the word, I'm showing much appreciation for that. But this is what is Junction about, and is also what Rapid Asia is about. I think is to try to promote informed discussion of this very important issue, notwithstanding the challenges that we have to address. So thank you for being here and for believing in the importance to indeed talk about migration based on research and fact, and work to try to address the negative perception of migrants. Now we know better what we have to deal with in Thailand as well as in other countries in Southeast Asia. So thank you for being here. There is coffee and tea outside to continue the discussion, and please continue to follow Junction. The next time is for an Indonesian film about gender and sexuality, so something very different, but still related, because even there is discrimination in the working. So thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you to the one that has been following. The number I've kept to the end, so this is very good for those that have stayed online. Thank you very much. Something before?
Can I, during like promoting information, something for those of you who interested on the migration issue this year, we also organized the international conference to commemorating International Migrant Day, as you already mentioned, at Chulalongkorn University. But this year will be online. We will provide you the information later on. We will organize on the 17th of December.
Junction is a partner of that too, so we will promote also on our website and our social media. So.
And second announcement for this campaign, phase 2, we will launch this year on 25th of November, which is to commemorating International Ending Violence Against Women Day. Actually, it will be online launch for all ASEAN member states, but in Thailand, we will also launch with the Ministry of Social Development and Human Security. And of course, you can also follow us from the ACWC Facebook page, and also with Junction, we will share the information.
And last announcement, because I forgot, please give a donation on your way out, because that helps Junction to continue to carry out this activity. Thank you very much.